Welcome inside another episode of Point to the Passer. Carolina's season came to an end late Friday afternoon after a 71-64 loss to Ole Miss that felt similar to so many other games we watched all season long, including the first game of the season versus Kansas out in Lawrence, where UNC goes down big in the first half, only to almost mount an unbelievable comeback. Except this time, almost doesn't cut it, and there are no do-overs. That's life in the postseason, and the Heels didn't have what it took to make a March run like we had all hoped. It was an interesting season of ups and downs, Jonathan. Not exactly the easiest one to make sense of yet, so we're going to try it tonight. I think we're just going to hold an open session this evening and feel our way through this one. How are you doing?
I think that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of where I'm at, and it is funny. I feel like this is maybe not just me, but just how a lot of Carolina fans feel, which is one of those years where we kind of made peace with the season multiple times, if that makes sense, of even the way the non-conference went, and you end up losing 5 games. Not ideal, but maybe we can turn it around and really roll in conference play. Doesn't happen that way. Squeak into the tournament when we thought we weren't going to get in, and then have that game against San Diego State, but then it's over in the first round. So it did feel like kind of saying goodbye to the season maybe more than once. And
Agreed.
in that way, compared to last year. Like last year was so abrupt, where you have a Final Four, even championship level contender playing really, really well, maybe their best basketball in March. So you feel like they're going to make a run, and it's over just like that against Bama in the Sweet 16. This time, it was different, right? We kind of had a long goodbye in a way. So in some ways, I'm at peace with it. In other ways, I'm still disappointed and frustrated, and even more so after seeing Ole Miss just roll over Iowa State. Granted, a injury depleted Iowa State team, but just thinking that could have been us if we would have showed up at the start of that game differently. So it's both. I was at peace with it, but I'm also I'm also frustrated and disappointed, like I am most Marches, because there's only a few, right? A handful in our lifetimes where we weren't disappointed. And that's just the way that March basketball goes.
Adam Lucas had a really good read. I don't know if you got a chance to take a look at his final article, but exactly the same perspective where, hey, only a few of these seasons actually end really well. The rest do end in disappointment. This one is just going to take a little while longer to process because it was so strange. As you mentioned, it felt like we were down and out in January, especially the Clemson game
Yeah.
in early February. It felt like things were really over. And you and I had definitely come to peace with it. And then, you go on this 6 game stretch and you start winning games, and your only two losses are against Duke. Again, it's the hope that kills you, and we said it on the pod, and it's exactly what drew us back in. And you saw flashes of how high the ceiling could be, but again, that's how March goes, and who knows what could have been. But we're not going to dwell too much on this loss. I think a lot of fans, a frustrating season, and probably one that they had come to peace with, or just some of them preferred it to be over. If we missed the tournament, it's a frustrating one, but they never really saw this team coming together and click. And I fully understand that. I'm always going to hope that there's a chance in March. I'm glad we got that chance. Unfortunate that we weren't able to deliver on a March run for the fans and for the team. I know they really, really wanted it. Just seeing Seth in the post game press conference, if you missed this moment, he had a really heartfelt moment with RJ sitting by his side when a reporter asked what RJ had meant to him and what he had taught him. And Seth, clearly very emotional, just sharing what he learned. And I'm sure all the other players feel this way too, what they had all learned from RJ. And just reflecting back on his legacy a little bit, Jonathan, what's it going to mean, when we look back at what he did for this team, not just dropping 42 points the night I was at the Miami game, or helping this team beat Duke and get to a championship game or a Sweet 16 or whatever it is, or just carrying this team on his back. What is that going to mean, years from now when we look back?
I'm glad we're recording a couple days after the game, because it did give us more time to think about that. And Isaac Shade with Locked On Tar Heels posted a great tweet about this, where he says RJ played every single game that Carolina played in over the last 5 years. That's 175 games, I think it was. Did not miss a single game. Not only did he not miss a game, he played in at least 10 minutes in every one of those games. So to me, I think you even posted something like this right after the game. His toughness, his heart, and just the way that he always showed up and he always brought it, even if he had an off night. To me, I was never questioning his care level, his want to, his competitiveness, and that doesn't even start to begin to talk about his level of talent and skill. Uh, but that piece, I think, just the way that he showed up and how much putting on a Carolina uniform meant to him, talking about when he was asked, what is it going to be like? This is the last time you put this uniform on. What is it going to be like? And it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. And he and Mondo, I think. So when I think about his legacy, both their legacies are their own, but there is a piece of it that will always be connected just because of how much they cared about the program, how much they did for the program, and that they'll both be honored in ways that we'll never forget. Mondo being the leading rebounder at UNC, and then RJ being up in the rafters from that season last year where he's ACC Player of the Year. He's first team All America. Uh, so that's the first part. The second part obviously is the 42 points against Miami, the 36 against Wake Forest,
Mhm.
those types of nights that you were able to be at and see him in person and just have your jaw drop with some of the plays that he was making when he was in a different level of his own last season, especially. Um, and then I also think about that sophomore season, really that Duke game at Cameron, which I can't remember. Was there a coach who coached his last game at home? There might have been. I'm fuzzy on the details, but that game where he dominated that second half down the stretch when Hubert made the decision, RJ is going to be the point guard of this team. We're going to move Caleb off the ball. And he was unstoppable. And not just in terms of scoring, which he was able to do in that game, but the decision making was pinpoint. And
Mhm.
so I admire that for somebody who is decorated as he is, even coming out of high school, right? As a scorer, that he always seemed to be able to shift to what the team needed. He did it during that stretch. And if it was scoring, Baylor in that second round, he goes for 30 plus, and you start to see what we were going to see a lot of in the next couple of years, especially that senior season. Um, and then that first half of the Duke game in the Final Four, he kept Carolina in it. He made big shots. So that those are the big things. He showed up, but he did whatever it really took. And this year won't be remembered in the same way, right? Obviously, he struggled, especially early, but he was still making those adjustments. I go back to that Notre Dame game where Ian was in the middle of that run of early, I think, of those 20-point games that we had to have to win those games. And RJ was a facilitator. He shifted more into that mode of, okay, this is what we need right now. Ian has it going. He is super hot. I'm going to get him the ball. When he could have been like, no, I'm the guy. Like my jersey's already in the rafters. You get the ball to me. And so that takes to me that deserves a ton of credit for somebody to have that level of leadership. And he's a different kind of leader. Like there was a lot of talk about, and maybe he's not the vocal leader. There's guys who are more vocal, like Tremble, I think is more of a vocal guy. We've seen that a lot this season. RJ led by example. He went out and did it with his actions and the way that he played. So I was really impressed by that. And then the senior season, I also think of Marcus Page because Marcus really struggled shooting it as well from the outside his senior season, and RJ's last year here, kind of the same. And then down the stretch, he was unconscious, man. I mean, the numbers were wild in that closing stretch in terms of his 3-point percentage. I think he got right back to where he was junior year. He was like 36.2%. He was very close to that by the end of the season when he was in the 20s for a lot of the year. Just on fire. That Duke game, senior night, I'll always remember that stretch where just the magic of RJ Davis in the Smith Center taking over a game. Didn't finish it, but that stretch was unbelievable. And then, of course, the San Diego State game where he did some things that have not been done at Carolina, going 6 for 6 from three, just how efficient he was. It was awesome. So those are the types of things that I think will stand out to me. I guess I'm also glad that I was wondering if he were going to get a game at the end of his career that aligned with how we remembered him, and that San Diego State game really did that. Certainly the Mississippi game wasn't his best performance, but that's not what I'm going to remember. Um, and yeah, there's other memories I mentioned. I'm sure you have some too. There's just so many things we could talk about him, both in terms of the tangible things that he did, but also the intangible things that he brought to the team.
For sure. That's a great breakdown and reflection. And you mentioned the Baylor game where he dropped 30 plus. I think that might have been the start of the RJ and the heels mentality for me, where it came, the first thought ever came into mind that this could be a thing. And who knew how much we would need it in his next season after that, where, you know, it really was RJ going for 30 plus and dropping 42 against Miami last season and just really putting the heels on his back. We had talked in our podcast group chat off and on about the growth of RJ from one year to the next going into that season. And we just, I think our minds were blown when he really showed us what he could do. I think everybody in that group chat had high expectations. A lot of fans had high expectations, but uh, far and away just became such an elite player and someone who you could trust with the ball. And, you know, if he's in the shooting guard role, it opens him up to really get that space and start dropping some threes, or if he needs to run point. I always felt like I had faith in him, and I always knew that he was going to be able to take it to the rim. And if he got fouled, I've never seen someone get so beat up, go into the boards, and get right back
Gosh,
up. He's not a big guy, and
no.
we're so fortunate when you mentioned that number of how many consecutive games. You know, I'm out here thinking these are Cal Ripken numbers, right? You know, you
So that's
get
what I thought
battered and
too.
bruised, and it's just that is a mentality, not just a stretch of good luck. It's got to be both. And to take care of his physical well-being, to always bounce back and always have a chip on his shoulder and show up when he needed to. I agree with you that 6 for 6 game against San Diego State felt really, really good for him to get. Again, granted, the run doesn't go as we had all hoped for, but to have that is special. And it reminded me of Marcus's game against Indiana that you
Yeah.
and I watched when we were in Greensboro living together. A lot of value in Greensboro, as we always like to say. A lot of value in watching games together there. And I think Marcus in that game dropped 4 threes in the first 4 minutes and five by the 10-minute mark. Ended up with at least 5 or 6. And so just sensational stuff. And I think it'll take a little bit of a step back to really appreciate how much he meant to this program. Obviously, a 5 year player, you get that extra year of attachment and growth, and kind of the same way we feel about Armando. But yeah, I think ultimately just so fortunate to have him. But the roster is going to look different next year, not just because of graduations, but because of the transfer portal. And we have a lot of stuff already happening. And Jay, I want to kind of scoot into that. Obviously, it's all kind of just beginning. It's overlapping with the tournaments. There's the coach portal going on with Will Wade at McNeese, now going to NC State. Conversations happening in the background. You've got moves from Drake to Iowa happening today. There are a bunch of things going on, but one of the most important positions for us is going to be point guard and assessing what that looks like going forward, and also getting a big man center. And I know you have some thoughts first on point guard, and then we can kind of jump into more discussions about the portal in general. There's already some big names, McNeely out of Virginia, that's out there, and some others that we'll get around to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wild time of year. I mean, this is I'm trying to put myself back at the end of last season, and it would have been around this time of year where the Sweet 16 is coming up, and you're thinking, okay, who's going to be back? Who are we bringing in? All of those things. This year, even though we made the tournament, it does feel a lot more like the 22-23 season, where it feels like there's probably going to be more of a reset. Now, there could be a core of guys like with that team, it was RJ and Armando primarily, right, who came back, and you knew those guys were going to be the core of the team, and they started out as the two linchpins, and then you bring in Ingram, you bring in Cormac and Elliot. Um, for me, just thinking about it, granted they have NBA decisions to make, but I start with Drake and Ian as the two pieces that you build around, and then certainly you have Caleb Wilson coming in as a 5-star top 10 level freshman. That those are the three pieces you build from there. I do think it's a big conversation and decision that they have at the really at the other guard spots. I think Seth and Elliot are probably the two that we'll see what happens with and how that fits together because I it's my opinion. I don't see the fit of the two of them together starting together. Just there's not enough proven shooting there, and I think we've seen how that can be a real challenge for Hubert Davis's system if you don't have enough floor spacers. And with those two guys and Caleb and Drake, you're going to need. I think Caleb and Drake are going to have moments from the outside, but they're not knockdown shooters. Um, so that's the part that I wonder about. And I know we've talked a ton about, well, both Elliot and Seth, but Elliot especially in terms of his development. And man, like coming out of high school, I go back to that was maybe one of our first podcasts where we were talking about him and how high we were on him. I haven't really cooled on that. I guess what I wonder is in this era of the portal, everything is just compressed in terms of you got to deliver each year. And this is a prove it year for Hubert Davis and Carolina's program. If they don't deliver in year five, he's on the hot seat. Like that's just the reality of the situation. So you're in a position where you can't gamble this year. You can't really wait for somebody to develop. And so that's what I wonder about Elliott, where it could really click. Not that he had a bad year this year, right? It's just very up and down. And the team was up and down with him, to be honest. There would be
Hmm.
games
Hmm.
where he was just the leader in plus minus, and you felt like and he did dominate the game. And then others where the decision making was a real big problem, both in terms of the fouls. Granted, some of that was the phantom fouls are just by reputation, but others were just not good decisions. And so that is part of growth. These guys grow at different rates. Um, Anyway, so all that to say, there's a big decision to make at point guard. There could be questions at shooting guard if Ian doesn't return. And then Drake, while he could also go pro, I hope he comes back. I think he has a great deal to gain if he does, and it certainly would be amazing for Carolina in year two. And then we're back talking about the five position, which we're going to be looking most likely for a starting center. I don't know about you, but I was really impressed by Vanell Lubin, especially down the stretch. Would love to see him back in a backup role. But I think if you're building a national championship contender, which is what they're trying to do, and why you bring in a general manager and pay him, over $1 million, you're going to want to have somebody who is a top flight contender level center. And so they're going to be most likely bringing somebody in to do that. So those are the decisions that I imagine will be on the table. But they've kind of said, look, everything's on the table here. We're not going to hold back. We can't afford to. And they have some difficult conversations to have, probably. Um, it is tough as a fan because it's very possible we have some guys that we've grown attached to, really been cheering hard for, that we watch play in different uniforms next year, which is just the reality, unfortunately,
Hmm.
of the new world. But it doesn't get easier for me, growing up in a time where typically you could expect if you had a guy for 3 years in college, they were going to be at the same school. So, yeah, there's a lot of change potentially on the horizon, and I think we're just kind of bracing for it right now as news will probably start to leak out here this coming week because the way that this happens is the season ends and then within a day or two they have a team meeting and they start to have individual player exit interviews. But I think the last piece on that is with Jim Tanner in the GM role now, that is a whole different dynamic. So he has a list of guys. He also has a kind of market level for each of these guys. So you're negotiating or renegotiating NIL numbers, which is completely different. So it could be that if we hear somebody's transferring, it might not be that A, it was their decision that they wanted to leave. B, it could also be that UNC wanted them back, but the number didn't match up. They
Hmm.
weren't, they weren't willing to budge on what the player or the agent wanted. So that's a whole different dynamic. And we may or may not learn about how all of that plays out, but it is something to keep in mind because it's definitely different from how it used to be.
For sure. And I think for me, a big part of why seeing RJ graduate hit me so heavy is exactly what you touched on of that's truly your last 4 year player. You have guys like Seth who have been around a couple years. Granted, Seth entered the transfer portal last year, decided to come back. And some of his comments, if you guys didn't get a chance to hear after the Ole Miss loss, where Seth saying, and I quote, "Absolutely, I want to come back to this school. I'm a Tar Heel," which is great to hear, and I'm hopeful that, in my personal opinion, I think he's a valuable asset. As you said, he's not a knockdown shooter, but he did have a really good leap this year and could have an equal style leap in the coming year and be a really good defender and get more consistent with his shot. So I think he's a good player to keep on our radar to have. But again, it's all about how the negotiations go with Jim Tanner and this new system and this new staff that's going to be in place in the offseason. So um, it'd be nice to have that 3, 4 year player again. I think RJ is really kind of the last of his kind, most likely, and then you have Seth here as maybe an additional where you get a couple years out of him, but anywhere from 1 year to two max with going forward. I think we just have to get used to it, and you're going to be choosing to cheer for UNC transfers on other teams. I mean, we'll get around to the Caleb Love storyline here in a bit, and that's a big one, of course. But like that's just how the game has changed. It's been fun for me to for you and me both to cheer on Kerwin Walton as he plays at Texas Tech, and what do you go 8 for 19 from three the other
19
night? I don't know what
attempts
you're
and
doing
8 makes.
shooting
Unbelievable. That would
19 from three.
8 makes from three. Probably the attempts too would be a
Unbelievable.
Carolina record in the tournament, but
Right,
eight would be the Carolina record
right.
and would also tie the Carolina record in a regular game.
Right. Yeah. So just absurd, but it's like it's those storylines that are really fun, but at the same time, you're mourning, at least for folks who have followed it for decades, or even just a decade, honestly, when you're seeing Marcus and Bryce back in, the 2013 to 2016 range. Like you're just not getting that anymore. So it does look different. I personally, the center for me is just such a huge factor. It was very clear that we missed last season. It was very clear week to week, you and I were looking at this roster saying they got such good guards, they got the talent to shoot, which really did kind of come to fruition near the end of the season. We had a lot of guys who were making shots and stepping up the way that we thought they would. But the center piece was just really, really difficult to miss out on and was not a traditional team. And you just didn't have all the pieces you needed to make a run. So this year, I'd love nothing more than to find a 7 footer who can play inside and shoot a three. Those guys exist in this game now. We've seen them. I hope they become available, and who knows who's quite out there yet. But I know we're going to have our eyes on some guys in the coming weeks. And the deadline, Jay, you mentioned was April 22nd, I believe. And
That's
so
right.
it's coming up in under a month. So this is going to move very, very quickly. We're going to try to stay on top of it as best as we can for you guys, and give some, weekly or every other week updates. But man, there's a lot to break down. And again, if you're sitting here analyzing Hubert and wondering whether he should be the guy or should not, that's not what we're going to do on this pod right now. We're going to take a step back from those conversations and look at all the variables. He's our guy right now. Let's see what he has a chance to work with, and let's take it from there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is going to go faster this time, so they've shortened the window, and that is something to just monitor. I think Carolina learned the hard way last year that they need to move faster in the portal. It's to their benefit to, and not that it's an allowed thing, but everybody does it because it's not enforced. Tampering now is part of the process. So you can
Hmm.
pretty much assume that every coaching staff has been reaching out to players really during the course of the entire season, probably,
Hmm.
but especially here over the last couple of months. So Carolina, before Tanner even got into the office, probably already had a board, I would imagine, of who they were monitoring. And now that's even more crystallized. So we're going to hear a lot of names now that are official in the next couple of days. And then also good to remember that the window for the portal is just to enter. You don't have to commit. So there will be some players that take a longer time and those that the draft process is going to be longer for. But related to last year, one of the things that hurt Carolina a bit was that Harrison Ingram really did seem like he was torn. He took some time to decide, which I completely understand, and I support that decision because if he had decided the other way and been like, you know what, I want to come back, that's also great to just take.
Hmm.
when you're that torn on a decision, it can take some time to make sure you make the right decision. So, and having said that, with Drake and Ian potentially having similar decisions to make, they're probably going to move faster in terms of just their process. So I think that part of it will be different. You might even have, ideally, I think you have guys coming in who are starter level that have to compete for a spot with some of these guys that would be coming back. And that's the way that you're approaching it, where nothing is guaranteed. That, look, we're building the best team we possibly can. And a lot of these guys would start elsewhere, but it's Carolina. So you're going to have to establish that you're the guy for that role. So that's something I think I'd want to see as well. With Hubert Davis's teams, the 4 spot, in addition to the 5, like you said, is so important. We saw with Jalen Withers just how much of a difference that made when he emerged down the stretch of this season. So that's something to keep an eye on too, where I would love to see them bring in a starter level guy to pair with Caleb Wilson, who I would assume would be the starter, but that way you have somebody that ideally can space the floor a little bit more. And for freshmen, they hit a wall sometimes. So if he goes through ebbs and flows like we've seen, you can have somebody who can play more minutes or just carry more of the load. So there's a few other things that I'm thinking about with just the roster dynamics and kind of how it unfolds. Um, yeah, the coach piece. I mean, Hubert is the coach. He's going to be the coach next year, and that's the part really that matters. I think after next year they're going to reevaluate and see how things went. But for me, as I look back on this season, if we do a post-mortem on the season, I'm thinking a lot about in his 4 years, the fact that if we when we think about what makes a great coach, one of the things that we think about is did he elevate the team collectively and even to some extent individually too, right? And I think it's fair to say, at least from where I'm sitting, the first year from February 15th on, they pushed all the right buttons, figured it out, and he clearly elevated that 22 team to as close to the ceiling as they possibly could get. They were playing unbelievable ball. He was
Mhm.
doing an unbelievable job coaching. And it's really the consistency because then we wouldn't say that that next team hit their ceiling or really came close to it. Last year, I think that probably was pretty close to that team ceiling, right? And then this year didn't happen. So the other piece in terms of elevating, there's the elevating piece, elevating your team, but there's also the guys who consistently get it done and find ways to expand that window of no matter who they have, it seems they figure out a way to consistently be there. I think even about going back to Dean, they were in the tournament. I can't remember the number of years, but it came up this year that they had gotten to the second round 18 straight years. I think it was 81 to 98. And Kansas had their streak snapped this year. If they had won this year, they would have been at 18, but they only had 17. That's just really hard to do. So that's the next step, I think. Because I think for me, Hubert is a good coach, but he's kind of needed to have the right mix of players, and that is true for a lot of coaches. So I'd like to see what happens in this next year because I think sometimes the other piece that we talk about a lot is do you embody the coach's personality, right? Like when you're out there on the floor as a team, do you take on your coach's personality? Patino, you have the toughness, the just kind of no, they're not taking any nonsense out there, especially on the defensive end of the floor. And last year really felt like that was Hubert's team. That was the passion, the toughness, the intensity, the attention to detail, the level of professionalism. And that was true in 22 at the end of the year, too. So we've seen it, but I guess my question is it's not translating all the time. So, and that is key is how does your coaching translate to your players? It's got to happen. So inconsistency, I think, is my takeaway. And I'm hoping that, part of it is let's build out the roster that you want, get the guys that you need and be able to evaluate these are my guys. These are guys that fit my system that can embody me on the floor. Um, and so hopefully we'll see that going forward because this is the year, man. This is the money year
Mhm.
for the program. The other piece of this is you mentioned the coaching portal. There's not a Roy Williams sitting out there. And we saw this with Kentucky. Fan base had high aspirations when Calipari left. And some of that was the fans right being upset that ironically now John Calipari's in the Sweet 16. Kentucky is too. So it worked out, good for both sides. But Billy Donovan, Brad Stevens gets mentioned for every single job. Nate Oates, you get on the
Hmm.
list of people, and they end up with Mark Pope, who's a very good coach, but he's not the, you know, rock star like Beatles front.
Right.
He's not John Lennon or somebody, right? He's
Right.
not the lead singer that's out there. Indiana, same thing. Darian DeVries, very good coach, but he's not Brad Stevens. That's my concern is if it's not Hubert Davis, we want to keep it in the family, ideally, but if we don't, Brad Stevens is not realistic. Billy Donovan is not realistic. Now, I could be wrong, but the chances are you end up with ideally an up and coming coach like those other two guys are. And then you just hope that it works out. So all that to say that yeah, that coaching piece, I mean, we're not gonna we don't have to focus on it more right now because he is the
Hmm.
guy.
Right.
I just hope that now that he has all these resources behind him, that we see a different outcome. Because yeah, it has not been to the standard over the last 4 years. It's been way too up and down. And just another piece of just how amazing that standard has been and how hard it is to live up to. That number, it was 36-2 in first round games ever in the NCAA tournament. That's ridiculous.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's now 36-3, but that is a ridiculous number.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are a few other thoughts with both the portal, but also just looking back on the season and what it means for Hubert, because it definitely has changed what next year means. That's for sure.
Consistency for sure is the word for me as well. You're gonna have to get consistent, not just in a 40-minute game. Please, for the love of my heart rate in the first half, please do not continue that to be the trend. But just throughout the season, starting in tournaments like Maui and the Bahamas and all those, it's got to start early on in the season. I want to see the competitive fight for 40 minutes. If we're losing a couple close games, I'm okay with it because that's going to be early season learnings. That's figuring out roster. It's the games like Dayton where you literally have to get RJ to go for 30 because your team didn't show up the first half and then, ends up winning by two. But other games like Florida comes to mind. As soon as, the team might start to put something together or you're hopeful, we get 20 minutes and it's a glimpse. And then suddenly a small team comes at you and they're dropping 90 in the Smith Center. It's like it was just all over the place and it was just kind of messing with fans' minds, honestly. I was like, I don't know what the ceiling is. Are we good? Are we not good? Can we be good? Can we not? And I think that's really what you have to get rid of. Hubert is dealing with a lot of variables, as we've mentioned. And yes, I'll circle back to this. He is our guy, and we're going to support him, and we'll see what the offseason brings. But he's also not the only coach dealing with this. And we've talked about this a good amount. Obviously, Calipari gets to Arkansas is having great success in the Sweet 16. Look at guys like Bill Self. He gets Hunter Dickinson as a transfer, and he wins one game in 2 years with Hunter Dickinson at the helm. Whether that speaks more to Hunter Dickinson or Bill Self or a combination of changing factors at Kansas as well, another blue blood program. I think all of that is something you have to take into consideration. Just like we did in 2023, UNC is number one preseason, doesn't make the tournament, wins zero games. Kansas makes the tournament, but wins zero games. There's so many different factors going on right now. So I think that's again, true UNC fans, just like let's keep at it, keep cheering on the squad, control what you can control, and that is, being a positive. You can be a critic, and you don't always have to be toxic positivity. You can provide, some analysis and thoughts, but don't bring the team and the staff down and the players. And that's, maybe that's a tangent for another time, but we've seen quite a bit of that, throughout the season too. So I think going into the offseason, like Hubert's the guy. Let's have his back. Let's have the team's back. Let's support the transfers if they decide to go elsewhere, and support people who come in and say, I want to play for Carolina. Let's make something happen and let's wear the name across the chest.
That's it. Have that pride in the uniform. Seth Trimble has talked about that a lot. And when we did not show up in games, especially that Clemson game, he's like, "This is not okay with me.
And I
Like
love that.
this uniform means something,
Yeah.
and we have to play with pride." And we did not do that tonight. We did not represent the uniform. Um, So for me, I'd love to have Trimble back. I'd love to have him back in probably a six-man role to start and just kind of see. But
Hmm.
he brings so many things, of course, athletically, talent-wise, but also just leadership-wise, that you need on a Carolina team to say, hey, this is what Carolina is about. This is what matters here. A guy who has said, like, this is where he wants to be. This is where his soul is, and he feels it on a deep level. Um, so yeah, I mean, your point about just circling back to like the up and down aspect of it this season, it was frustrating because it was also unclear why is this happening, right? And whose fault is
Hmm.
it?
Hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting that depending on who you listen to, and more so I'd say media and fans in general tended to put it on Hubert and say, you got to get your team prepared. Like that Ole Miss game, we just did not come out with the level of intensity. It was way too casual. I don't know if we were too relaxed or what the situation was, but we did not come in locked in at
Hmm.
all with the attention that game needed because Ole Miss definitely did
Yeah.
right from the tip, and they let us feel it on multiple levels. Um, and then the players, like former players, Theo Pinson, especially, and those guys, Justin Jackson, saying, no, it's not. It's not on the coach to coach effort. It's not. And so I do think it's both. I think it's a combination, right? And usually it is. But for whatever reason, this team just did not come in locked in the way they needed to be. And because of the limitations to the roster, they really did have to play with their hair on fire all the time. And when they did, like you said, we were one of the best teams, if not sometimes the best team in the country
Hmm.
when we did that. And your point about like then 8 minutes later in the game, are we any good? I remember sitting at Allen Fieldhouse and literally having Kansas fans being like, I thought they were supposed to be good
Hmm.
when we got down 20 or whatever it was in the
Hmm.
first half
Yeah.
and we're down 15 at halftime. I thought this was a good team. And then the second half, they weren't asking those questions
No, they
anymore
got
because
hush hush real quick.
yeah, when you're down three or four with 4 minutes to go. Um, so I think that was part of the frustration was you could see what it could be, and so um, I don't know. Is there accountability as a piece of that? Because again, talking about that translating, that was not an issue last year. You could point to probably one game where the focus was not where it needed to be, and that was that Clemson game after we played Duke. And there's a clear reason for that, right?
Hmm. Yep.
Um, I don't love quoting Seth Greenberg right now, especially after he just dragged us for a week or plus. But human nature is undefeated. That's something he says all the time, and then that was that night. But outside of that, it was a very professional approach. Um, so was there not accountability this time? Did that part not translate? Um, I wonder that. We're not in practice. We know that Hubert's kicked guys out of practice before, so he's doing things. But is that as impactful as having a treadmill next to the court like Patino does, where all right, if you mess up, you're running,
Or taking the
um,
rims off.
right, or take the rims off like Roy. But I mean, you even look at Patino; they're not playing right now either. So
Hmm.
it's not one thing, but I think that was really to me one of the frustration points of the season was you could just see how good they could be. And that Ole Miss game, I think I even texted you. I was like, I'm not even getting my hopes up right now because, and I wasn't actually too down either when we were down by 20 because like we know what this script
We've
is,
seen it. Yeah, they're gonna make it close, and it's either gonna be frustrating or it's not.
or they're just going to eke it out. But most likely, it's going to
Right.
be frustrating because against basically every good team this year, we just didn't have enough at the end because we dug
Mm.
ourselves too deep a hole at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I this is very unique. And I think that's when we take a step back, you look at how volatile the team was in individual games like that, where I think we had a stretch where we gave up 90 points in multiple games and I'd have to go back and look, but there were multiple things that had not happened before. One was the points we gave up. One was the balance of our guys, where five guys in double figures for four straight games, six guys, I think, for a stretch. That had never happened. So things positive were happening that had never happened at Carolina. Things negative were happening that had not happened in forever. It's a very unique team in that way. And I think next year will be completely different. We don't know what it's going to look like, but um, I don't think we're going to see that again. I would be very
Mhm.
surprised if this continues because it hadn't happened under Hubert until this year. Just
Mhm.
part of this team and part of the culture of the team, I guess, and just how it played out.
Yeah. Yeah, time will tell. It's just one of those things in the offseason we'll have to pay particularly close attention to. But Jonathan, any other thoughts on transfer portal or where we're at right now? I know we're, technically in an offseason pod, but still a ton to talk about. So I want to give you the floor to wrap anything up for the night.
Well, we didn't really talk too much about the Ole Miss game, and we don't need to dive into it too deep, but I do want to say that if Sean Padula needs some NIL ideas, that I've got a couple for him. One is AAA, or really any travel agency, because dude, the number of steps, the journey that his pivot foot went
Yeah,
on
frequent
that
flyer out
play,
here.
it was one of those. I mean, granted, like they clearly did not do enough Carolina to put themselves in position to win the game. But that has been frustrating too. That's a whole nother offseason pod is the officiating this year.
Hmm.
But in a key moment again, you have a obvious travel like that where we needed a stop and it doesn't happen. So yeah, Sean, get your people with me. I have a lot of ideas. We can figure something out.
Yeah, I think a few of the replays was just like stutter steps on stutter steps, and like where are you going? Do we even teach a pivot foot to these guys anymore, or is that just out the window? And now you have, the whole controversy with the Maryland play at the end of the game too, with Queen taking the 2 to 3 steps. That one bothers me a little less. John Fanta had a nice little rant about that. I get it, but the officiating needs a hard look, and alongside that, so does the review process.
Yeah, no, the Queen thing I have no problem with.
That's
And
yeah,
that
exactly.
that is something that's typically not called. And finally, we got a buzzer beater. I was waiting for really a intense game, but the first buzzer beater of the tournament, that was awesome.
Yeah.
And I guess, as we're wrapping up, last segment, I guess, or topic would be the tournament really as a whole. You were in Raleigh, so you got to see a couple of these games. What was the experience like? Just being back at the NCAA tournament for the first time, I think, in a couple of years, and
Hmm.
being that close to Dan Hurley. What was that like?
I did not have time to get an OU Brady Manic shirt or run to Franklin Street to get a Carolina one, but I did enjoy watching OU in Connecticut, except for the fact that OU could not finish around the rim to save their life. I'm actually really surprised how well Connecticut hung in with Florida because after the game I had chatted to you about this and said I just don't think that there's any way either of these teams keeps up with Florida. And
Yeah.
UConn, to their credit, did a nice job. But it was a pretty pro UConn crowd, but you still heard the boos early on when Hurley came out of the tunnel and was announced. So that brought a little cheer to my heart.
And, and unfortunately, it has the reverse effect on him. So, like we talked about, if you really want to get in his head,
Thriving in
you
there.
cheer him.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you could tell I was waiting for him to pump up the crowd or do one of these with his hand to his ear,
Right.
pump everybody up. But no, the March Madness games are always exciting. It's good to have Marcus Pagerina be a host of one. Always nice to see.
That is good. If Marcus is not going to still be part of the tournament and we're out, at least Marcus Pagerina had some good action there. Yeah, you mentioned the Caleb Love game. I mean, that is the one that, as Carolina fans, that's been one of the questions: is who do you cheer for now? And typically, for me, it's always against Duke. Like I,
Always.
I
Yeah.
just will be sick if they win the national championship. And we've had a good run here for like a decade,
Hmm.
so let's keep it going. So that's mission number one. But yeah, to see Caleb do well, and he had 29 against Oregon
Classic
and
Caleb.
5 of 7 from three. But we were worried, right? Leave some for Duke. They
Yeah.
needed all of it to advance because he really carried them in that game. But he gets one more shot at Duke, and we both saw that post game interview with him where they asked him, "Okay, you're playing Duke. How do you beat this Duke team?" and that was just amazing. His response where he just takes a breath and then you see him just thinking about something in his mind and smirking, and then he gives the very polished media response after that.
Hmm.
But he had to be thinking about the shot, right? Like that's immediately where his mind goes was, wait, it's going to be tough, but oh, I already did that, so I can do that.
Yeah, easy. Been there, done that in a bigger game. This is just a Sweet 16.
Right. Yeah, it's not the Final Four. This is not the biggest rivalry in college basketball history. Like
Unbelievable.
this is no problem. No
I
pressure.
love seeing the support from Carolina Nation for him. And I would say part of it is that we're not in the tournament anymore, but it's really not because even when Carolina was in the tournament and even, regular season last year, you saw it. Arizona goes to Cameron Indoor and pulls it off, and Caleb's waving to the crowd, and you and I are watching that together. And it's like, it's that tie-in with the transfer. So again, transfer market changes everything, but at the same time, these guys are Carolina guys.
They are. So that part of it is, that part of it is pretty cool. That's the storyline I have my eyes on. I mean, I think the other things that are coming up for me just with the way this tournament is shaping up, it really is chalky. Like you have all of the
Hmm.
really all the contenders except for the ones that we picked, I guess. We both
Apparently,
had too much confidence in St. John's,
that
so that didn't work
I
out.
did. I
But
knew it was their flaw, and they hadn't had a cold game in so long, and of course, you know, it happened. But credit to Arkansas, I guess.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, it's just disappointing because I did want it was a fun story. But outside of that, because Maryland knocked off Colorado State at the buzzer, there's no 12 seeds left. McNeese and Colorado State are both out, and they aren't even the true Cinderellas, right? Um,
Right.
and then Drake gets knocked off as well.
I
So
know.
you're really just talking about chalk. These all the number one seeds are still in it. You have
Yeah,
three out
and
of
your
four.
Cinderella is from the SEC, so it just doesn't feel like it. Like the days of the mid majors coming in. Granted, a lot of this plays in NIL money and who they're getting, and what does that mean for mid majors? And maybe we're kind of seeing a little bit of the start of it. The Cinderella teams might be those deeper teams in these conferences that weren't expected to make a run, and then you get 10 seed Arkansas in there.
Yeah, you might be right. I mean, I think it is something to monitor because the numbers on this were some of the lowest upsets in a long time. Um, so it is a unique tournament in that way. But outside of Arizona and of course Duke losing, the things I'm also rooting for, if that doesn't happen, then I'd love to see. I'm not a huge Michigan State fan actually, but I respect their program, and I think it's a cool story that Jace Richardson is the son of Jason Richardson, and they won in 2000. So I think that'd be cool. 25 years later, that
Mhm.
father and son, if they both won championships, and that would be the first Big Ten championship since then.
Mhm.
And then the other one for me is Houston with Kelvin Sampson. I just have a
Yeah.
lot of respect for Kelvin Sampson. They've just been consistent. You talk about consistency. They've been there so many times here. One Final Four, so that would be cool if they were able to get it done. So those are the ones that I'm kind of looking towards. Still, there's still March Sadness for me though. Let's be honest. Like
Yeah,
I
same
said, I
here.
was at peace with it. I'm really not.
Yeah, it's a tough one
It
for
still
sure.
hurts.
Yeah, it's gonna hurt for a while until we get a 7 foot transfer that we're excited about who can launch threes as well.
And then we play jump around and we're back, baby.
Then we're here. Yeah, we'll be just fine. We get
I
another
do
Carolina
blame Seth
legend, be
Davis.
fine.
I blame Seth Davis because after again one of the guys who was dragging us for not should not be in, he brings out a Ramses mascot. He brings out the North Carolina logo and says they're the lock of the tournament that they're
It
going
is
to
so
get to the
cringe
next
too.
round. He knew exactly what he was doing. Thanks,
Yeah.
Seth.
Yeah.
As a Duke alum, thanks a lot for that. I knew when that happened, I was like, this isn't
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, we might be toast. Yeah. Well, the tournament always delivers, and unfortunately, it delivered us an early exit. Really disappointing. But hey, part of being a sports fan in general, no matter what the team is you cheer for, is going to be those ups and downs. So, I want to put you on the spot to close the show here and see who you want to point out to close this one. We've got some options. I'm going to leave the floor wide open because a lot of times you and I chat about this beforehand, and sometimes we just wing it together and go with our gut. So I'm gonna give the floor to you, and who's it gonna be this evening?
It's got to be RJ.
It's the right
Just
call.
for what we talked about at the beginning with his legacy, everything that he just embodied. You mentioned it, not a big guy, and he played so much bigger than his size throughout his career.
The
Huge
definition of
heart.
a tough little nut.
Absolutely, man. I mean, huge heart, the toughness, the New York mentality, the style of play, the flair that he played with. And I will be watching those games for a long time. I will be showing my son highlights of RJ Davis for a long time. And he'll probably be at some point trying to do some of those crossover step backs, especially
Totally.
that Miami game one.
He's already dunking on a 2.5 foot rim, so
He is
he's well
dunking
on
on the
his
two and
way.
a half foot rim. Yeah, we're almost to the step back. That's the next. Can't even dribble yet, but we're gonna work on that. Um, so that's the one for me is RJ
For
Davis, and
sure.
just honestly saying thank you to him for choosing Carolina. Somebody like him could have gone a lot of places. He comes to Carolina, and then for everything that he brought to the program. Not to mention that first year was that weird COVID year where there were not fans at the beginning of the season. They had a lot of restrictions. And so there's resilience that you got to persevere to even stay at the school, I think. Because we saw a lot of people leave. Just the experience was not the same. Uh, so thankful to him, but also I'm happy for him that he got those true Carolina moments. He beat Duke in the Final Four. You know, he played in a national championship. They came that close. He is an All-American, ACC Player of the Year, won the ACC regular season. You do get a trophy for that, Duke and State fans.
Apparently, yeah,
Duke
that's what
fans
I've heard
now
now.
are saying that you do because they got one, so now it
Right,
exists.
right.
Um, but
That's how the
yeah,
narrative goes.
unbelievable. But yeah, RJ, I still don't really have the words. It'll take a while, but I can't wait for when his video's up there in the Smith Center and he
Mm-hmm.
comes up and says, I'm a
That'll
Tar Heel, and the
that'll hit
crowd
hard.
just loses
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. No, special memories with him. So, good luck to everybody in their bracket the rest of the way. Jonathan, maybe that doesn't even go for you and me. We're pretty out of it. So just
Cooked.
just discard that tweet that we sent out with our predictions. Never happened. It was just the fake news on Twitter going around. You saw nothing. It was pretty rough year for us.
I mean, at least my title still is true, which is Where State, because they were never in it to start with. And they're hanging the banner for hiring Will Wade. That'll be something I'm sure we'll talk about when we get there next year. But yeah, I can still say Where State because you're
You
still
can.
not in it.
I can still say Rick Pitino Redemption Tour just maybe next year. It was just a year early.
Yeah,
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 so
yeah. If he retires, he's going to have to jump in the East River. That was the promise that he
that's
made.
all I
So
was looking forward to.
until he wins
Exactly.
it all again.
Yeah. So yeah, enjoy the Sweet 16 games, and we'll just have to say go anybody but Duke. And a week from now, if Caleb pulls the trigger on it and takes them out, then we'll have a special point out. That's for sure.
I think we have to do an emergency pod.
Oh yeah, we'll be on. We'll be on Twitter Spaces. We'll be on all of it. It's good stuff. Thanks for being on tonight, Jay. I will catch you soon, and to all the Heels fans out there, appreciate your support this season, and into the off season in the portal we go.
Go Heels.
Go Heels.